On the morning of the 6th of December, 1917, the children of Halifax pressed their faces to frosted windows to watch a ship burn in the harbor. It was a rare and beautiful thing, a vessel wreathed in fire, throwing up columns of orange smoke against a cold blue sky. Along the waterfront, people stopped to look. Workers paused at their benches. And not one of them knew that the burning ship below was the largest bomb the world had ever assembled, or that within minutes it would erase their city from the map. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion, the greatest man-made blast in human history before the atomic bomb, a disaster that killed nearly 2,000 people in a fraction of a second, and then slipped almost entirely out of the world's memory. To understand that morning, you have to understand the harbor. By 1917, the First World War had turned Halifax, Nova Scotia, into one of the busiest ports on Earth. Its deep, ice-free harbor was a gathering point for convoys carrying troops, supplies, and munitions across the Atlantic to the trenches of Europe. Warships and freighters crowded its waters. At the heart of it lay a narrow channel called the Narrows, the tight passage every ship had to thread to reach the inner basin. On that December morning, two ships were moving toward it from opposite directions. One was the Emo, a Norwegian steamer chartered to carry relief supplies to occupied Belgium, running late and pushing hard to get out to sea. The other was the Mont-Blanc, a French cargo ship arriving from New York, and the Mont-Blanc was a floating powder keg. In her holds and stacked on her deck sat more than 2,500 tons of high explosives, TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, and barrels of benzol fuel. She carried enough force to level a city, and she was steaming quietly toward one. In the Narrows, the two ships misread each other's course. Signals were sounded, engines thrown into reverse, but it was already too late. The Emo's bow ground into the side of the Mont-Blanc. The impact itself was minor, but it toppled the barrels of benzol, and sparks from the scraping steel set the fuel alight. Fire raced across the French ship's deck. Her crew understood, instantly and completely, what lay beneath their feet. They abandoned ship, rowing frantically for the far shore, shouting warnings that no one on the docks could hear or understand. The Mont-Blanc, burning and unmanned, drifted gently across the water until she came to rest against Pier 6 at the foot of the crowded working-class district of Richmond. For about 20 minutes, the ship burned in plain sight, and the city came to watch. It was a spectacle, the flames, the strange-colored smoke, the drama of it all on an ordinary Thursday. Crowds gathered along the shore. Faces filled the windows of homes, schools, and factories, every one of them turned toward the water. The fire brigade raced to the pier. None of them knew they were standing at the very edge of a bomb. In the railway telegraph office near the waterfront, a dispatcher named Vince Coleman had been warned by a fleeing sailor what the ship truly carried. He and a colleague ran for their lives. And then Coleman remembered something. A passenger train full of people was inbound for Halifax, due at any moment. He turned back. He sat down at his telegraph key, and he sent a message down the line to stop the train. His final words, tapped out into the wire, have survived. Munitions, ship on fire, making for Pier 6. Goodbye. He stayed at his post. He did not survive. At 4 seconds past 9:04 in the morning, the Mont-Blanc detonated. The explosion released the energy of nearly 3 kilotons of high explosive, the most powerful man-made blast in all of history until the nuclear age that still lay decades away. In an instant, the temperature at the ship's core surged to thousands of degrees. A white fireball climbed over the harbor, followed by a towering column of black smoke. The shock wave flattened everything within half a mile, some 300 acres of the city, in a single breath. The entire district of Richmond simply ceased to exist. The blast was felt more than 200 miles away, and fragments of the ship were hurled for miles. Part of her anchor, weighing half a ton, came down on the far side of the peninsula. Then came the second wave. The explosion shoved the harbor aside so violently that it raised a tsunami, which surged back over the shore and swept away those the blast had spared, including a Mi'kmaq community that had lived at the water's edge for generations. And there was a crueler injury still. All those faces at all those windows turned toward the beautiful burning ship. When the shock wave struck, it drove the glass inward. Hundreds of people were blinded in a single moment, cut down by the very windows they had run to watch from. The study of their wounds would go on to change the practice of eye medicine forever. When the smoke finally cleared, nearly 2,000 people were dead and around 9,000 were injured. 6,000 more had no home left to return to. And then, as if the day had not taken enough, the sky turned. A blizzard descended on Halifax the next morning, burying the ruins and the survivors in snow, freezing the rescuers as they dug through the wreckage for the living. Help came from an unexpected direction. In Boston, hundreds of miles to the south, word of the disaster arrived by telegraph, and the city answered within hours, sending trains loaded with doctors, nurses, and supplies north through the storm. Halifax never forgot it. To this day, more than a century later, the province of Nova Scotia sends the city of Boston an enormous Christmas tree every single year, in thanks for the help that came when it was needed most. And out of the ruins came something quieter, but lasting. A young clergyman and scholar named Samuel Henry Prince had lived through the explosion, and he set out to study it. His work became a doctoral thesis at Columbia University, published in 1920, and it is now regarded as the first systematic study of a disaster ever written. In trying to understand how a city dies and how it claws its way back, Prince helped invent the modern field of disaster research, the very discipline that today shapes how the world prepares for catastrophe. The people of Richmond never knew it, but their deaths would help teach the world how to save others. Historians like Janet Kitts have since spent decades recovering the names and faces the blast tried to erase, rebuilding the lost city out of letters, photographs, and memory. And yet, outside of Canada, the Halifax explosion remains one of the great forgotten catastrophes. A disaster of almost nuclear scale that struck nearly 30 years before the first nuclear weapon, and then faded quietly into the shadow of a larger war. So remember the harbor on that clear December morning. Remember the children at the windows, watching something beautiful and terrible that they did not understand. And remember how little stood between an ordinary Thursday and the end of a city. The length of a burning ship's slow drift toward a pier and 20 minutes of fire.